Joining me now, Liberal MP Paul Fletcher in Sydney and Labor MP Andrew Leigh here in the Canberra studio. Thanks for your time this morning, gentlemen. First to you, Andrew Leigh. This back down from the government on the Sri Lankan asylum seekers, is that an indication that the process, the screening out process, is not proper or not lawful?
David, we're comfortable with the screening process we're using around asylum seekers, and the questions we ask is the questions that all countries should ask if somebody is claiming refuge, which is, are you fleeing persecution? And where people don't engage those international obligations, they're returned, as has happened for about 700 people to Sri Lanka.
Why back down then when challenged?
Well, this case is specific to the facts involved. It doesn't affect our broader screening process. The refugees concerned will stay in Australia until such time as the court case is concluded. If that concludes with the decision that they are not genuine refugees, then they'll be returned safely by plane, not by a sort of boat turnaround as others might have.
We're just going to take a quick pause. No, we're not. We were going to go to something else, but we'll keep on this topic for the moment. Paul Fletcher, I want to ask you, do you have any concerns with the government's screening out process as it's known?
Well, there's a fundamental concern that this government has lost control of Australia's borders, and their management of the asylum seeker issue lurches from chaos to mismanagement to complete lack of control. The Minister is quoted in The Australian this morning as saying no one should doubt the government's resolve to break this pattern, speaking of the pattern of people coming from Sri Lanka and other places. The problem is that everybody doubts this government's resolve to break this pattern. This government has very little credibility on the issue of how it deals with those coming to Australia largely, or in many cases, motivated by economic considerations rather than the refugee test, which Andrew referred to earlier.
In the last 2 weeks, though, the government has sent back to Sri Lanka more people than have actually arrived in the last 2 weeks. Is that an indication that, in your eyes, things are working?
The fundamental problem is that this government has been all over the place since coming to power in 2007. They came to power with a policy to completely reverse the Howard government's proven policies which had secured control of our borders. And after several years, when it became clear that their policies were not working, they've sought to move back towards being in a position, as Minister Bowen has said, of seeking to break this pattern. But the problem is nobody believes this government's resolve because they've sent such terribly mixed messages to people overseas who may be contemplating making a risky and dangerous journey by boat, and we've seen the consequences. Thousands of people making that journey each year. We also know, tragically, that significant numbers of people are dying along the way. So this is a very bad humanitarian outcome, and it's a sign of a government which has lost control of policy in this area. And what we're seeing in relation to this flip-flopping in the case of the specific Sri Lankan people who we're speaking about here is an example of that chaos.
Okay, well look, we've got a lot to get through. I know you want to respond to that, but I do want to punch through a few issues this morning. One of them being the government's plans to hand over environmental powers to the states, or many of the powers to the states, to try to nationalise the system of environmental laws, to make things easier for businesses. Well, the businesses are coming to town today, and they're going to be told, Andrew Leigh, that this plan has fallen flat. Who's to blame for that?
Well, David, I'm certainly as keen as anyone to minimise the amount of green tape that people have to go through, but you don't do that by setting up a process with states that don't have legally solid environmental approval processes. And the best example I can give you of this is what happened with the Alpha Coal approval, where the Campbell-Newman's Liberal government in Queensland rushed it through, potentially a project which could have damaged the Great Barrier Reef, and we at the federal government then found we had to start again, do the whole process ourselves. So that doesn't help business because it then gives you legal uncertainty. You've handed a power over to the states, but their approval process isn't one that'll stand up in court, and that provides all kinds of uncertainty for business.
So is it that the government doesn't trust the states with these laws?
We need to make sure that we have state governments which are able to put in place legally solid environmental approval processes. If we don't have that, then we shouldn't be handing these processes over to the states.
Paul Fletcher, do you believe these sorts of powers should be handed to the states?
Well, the Coalition's policy is to move to a one-stop shop process for environmental approvals. Greg Hunt and Tony Abbott have been very clear on that for a considerable period of time. There is a clear problem of duplication of very similar and in many ways fundamentally overlapping processes between state and federal government when it comes to environmental approvals.
So who should be responsible then for those laws, the states or the Commonwealth?
Well, our policy is to have a one-stop shop approval process at the state level. This notion that we've heard from both Andrew Leigh and Sarah Hanson-Young a bit earlier on your program that the states can't be trusted is not one that we agree with at all. The important thing is to have the processes, which are very, very similar and involve substantial duplication, inefficiency and overlap, being rationalised so that one level of government takes the principal responsibility. And that means that we achieve the very important environmental outcomes and safeguards. The substance remains, but you have material efficiencies in process, allowing major projects to come on stream more quickly, delivering jobs and delivering economic benefits for Australia. And after yesterday's very soft GDP growth numbers, that's exactly the kind of policy we need, and that's what the Coalition will be working towards if we're elected next year.
Paul, I agree with you entirely on the principle of streamlining environmental regulation, but the concern that we have is that if we do it in a way where the states don't do a proper environmental process, then that can be challenged in court. And that's not good for business certainty. So that's our main worry, and that was the Alpha Coal concern.
The concern you have is that things won't be done in a way that suits Canberra and in a way that ticks the boxes that you think are important. It's the sort of arrogant notion that only one level of government can properly make these decisions. We certainly reject. The important thing is to get the criteria clear in the legislation, be absolutely clear about the environmental objectives that must be achieved, but then have an efficient process without the duplication that is inherent in the overlap that we have today.
Okay. Look, we've got to take a break. I'm sorry to cut in again, Andrew Leigh, but we'll be back with our panel right after this.
Hello. I'd like to tell you about Bet365.com, the world's biggest online sports betting company. The reason why they're the world's #1 is very simple. They do great odds on a massive choice of sports. And guess what? Bet365.com is now based in Australia.
No matter how busy things get, we'd never miss this.
Hey, honey. Sorry I'm late.
I want things to stay this way forever, but you never know what life has in store. If something were to happen to Stephen or myself, we still want our family to be able to enjoy these simple pleasures. With Guardian, it was simple to put a plan in place to protect what matters most, the security of our family.
With Guardian Life Insurance in place, you can relax knowing your family's financial future is secure, come what may. You can select a substantial life insurance benefit of up to $1.5 million, which is paid to your family should you pass away. Plus, cover includes a terminal illness benefit and an immediate $15,000 payout to help with funeral costs while a claim is being processed at no extra charge. Application is simple with no medicals, blood tests or forms to fill out.
Family's everything. That's why we're with Guardian.
So call 1300 712 508 to see how simple it can be to protect your family's financial future with Guardian Life Insurance.
They don't care about my disability. They don't give me any sympathy.
And they don't offer me charity.
Instead, House with No Steps creates opportunities for me, so I have a job I love.
They taught me the skills to be independent.
And they offer me the support I need.
This cricket season promises to be the hottest event in town this summer. See Sri Lanka play their first ever test match against Australia at the SCG, followed by a blockbuster KFC T20 international match at Stadium Australia. Cricket New South Wales have a variety of unique packages for companies of any size for the Vodafone Test Match, Commonwealth Bank Series and KFC T20 International. To secure the ultimate corporate experience, visit cricketnswhospitality.com.
Look at this, a half-inch socket set.
Super Cheap Auto has every guy's most wanted list covered this Christmas, including car seat covers, air compressors and toolboxes.
What sound does the drill make?
Welcome back. Just before we go on with our political discussion, we're going to take you to some comments just made by the opposition leader Tony Abbott from Port Macquarie. He was speaking about the passing of Elizabeth Murdoch.
With Dame Elizabeth Murdoch's passing, we have lost a truly remarkable Australian. She was a great patron of many good causes. She was someone who represented much that was the very best in our national character. She was a link with almost 100 years of Australian history. Her husband, Sir Keith, was at Gallipoli. He was one of the famous war correspondents of the First World War, as well as being a giant of the Australian media in the first half of the last century. So this is a sad day, but we reflect on a long and a fine life. We reflect on a life well lived, so we can celebrate a great Australian as well as mourn her passing.
And the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, has just put out a statement as well, sending her condolences to the Murdoch family. She says Dame Elizabeth Murdoch lived a great Australian life. Her example of kindness, humility and grace was constant. She was not only generous, she led others to generosity. Australia's children and Australia's artists have lost one of their greatest benefactors. Dame Elizabeth's name will be rightly remembered by countless Australians, and in many Australian places where her philanthropic work was so deeply appreciated. Australia has lost an amazing Australian woman. So from both sides of politics, condolences now sent to the Murdoch family. Now on with the show, and I want to talk about the economy now. Jobs figures out today. We saw GDP figures out yesterday that showed growth slowing in the most recent quarter, but the upside of that is that interest rates may stay low or even go lower, as low as 2%. That's much lower than they were under John Howard, Paul Fletcher. Is that a good thing?
Well, the reason that interest rates are so low is a recognition that the economy is soft and getting softer. We have a particular segment, the mining resources segment, which has been doing well, and that's a good thing, but that has disguised very substantial softness in other parts of the economy, and it's very clear as you get around talking to business people, both big business and small business, that conditions in sector after sector are very soft, and that of course is bad news when it comes to job prospects and other issues. So in essence, we've had a government which has assumed that everything is fine because of the resources sector, but they've really failed to recognise that there are some real issues across the economy. And so while the Reserve Bank has taken the right action in reducing rates, it's a sign that there are some significant economic troubles, and there's no real sense that the current crew in Canberra with responsibility for dealing with this are actually taking the actions that are necessary to address it.
Andrew Leigh, the US is facing much bigger issues, the so-called fiscal cliff. Do you see any similarities between what they're facing and what the Gillard government is trying to do?
Well, certainly what you see in the United States, I think, David, is a set of conservative opponents who are unwilling to recognise that you've got to get the balance right between taxing and spending. What we've done in Australia is put in place sensible, economically responsible revenue-raising measures, whether that's the price on carbon pollution or the minerals resource rent tax, but we've also brought down income taxes. And so that set of reforms has underpinned the strong growth, which is above trend, unemployment, which is lower than it has been in recent decades, and inflation sitting in the RBA target band. They're a set of economic numbers that I think most countries around the world would be pretty happy to have in front of them.
Okay,
there's always challenges, but these are a very good set of economic numbers.
Just a minute or so left. I want to ask you, Andrew Leigh, about Labor reform. Calls from John Faulkner and others in the party to get rid of the factions, but you have a different idea for a way forward: social liberalism. Can you explain that briefly for us?
Well, David, I gave a speech yesterday at Per Capita arguing that with the Liberal Party of Australia now effectively having become the Conservative Party of Australia, the mantle of small L liberalism, of standing up for minorities, of putting in place market-based reforms, is now available again. And I think that mantle naturally falls to the Labor side of politics through our record of supporting minorities, of putting in place reforms like a national disability insurance scheme, and being willing to use market-based mechanisms on things like the Murray-Darling and on climate change.
Paul Fletcher, is there any room for the Liberal Party, the coalition, to reform, for example, to engage women or to engage younger voters?
Look, I think it's a ridiculous claim that the union-driven Labor Party is now the home of small L liberalism. But look, I find myself agreeing with Kevin Rudd, who said that the Labor Party has a sickness right now. I think that's right. I think the best thing for the Labor Party and for Australia is that if it has a significant period in opposition, to seek to cure itself, and we would all wish it well in doing that.
Okay, Paul Fletcher, Andrew Leigh, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Paul.
Now, as I mentioned,